The morning that changed everything. Daniel Thompson woke up to the familiar hum of his mother's voice. The soft cadence of her words broke through the fog of his dreams, slowly pulling him into the world of reality. "Rise and shine, sweetheart," his mother, Angela, called from the tiny kitchen of their modest apartment. Her voice carried warmth, even in the early morning hours, and Daniel smiled, feeling the first pangs of hunger settle in his stomach. He rubbed his eyes, blinking against the hazy remnants of sleep. The day ahead was waiting for him, though, and he had no time to linger. He stretched out in his bed, the creaky wooden frame groaning beneath him. The posters of basketball players, his heroes, adorned the walls. Some of the posters were a bit tattered at the edges, others faded with time. But to Daniel, they represented hope. They were symbols of something bigger than his current reality. Something better. On those posters, his idols stood tall, dribbling and dunking on the court, winning games and hearts across the nation. They had come from humble beginnings just like him. One day, Daniel would make it too. He just had to keep dreaming and working hard. Daniel's room was small, like the rest of their apartment. The peeling paint on the walls hinted at the wear and tear of the years, but his mother made sure it was always clean and tidy. It was a space that Daniel had grown to love, despite its size and imperfections. It was his sanctuary, his safe place. Today, though, his focus was on the day ahead, school, and everything else that came with it. After a quick stretch and a yawn, Daniel climbed out of bed. His uniform, worn but well-maintained, was laid out neatly on the chair beside his desk. His mother had spent hours over the weekend mending his clothes, patching up small tears and ensuring his shoes were polished. She didn't have much, but she made sure Daniel always had what he needed. Her sacrifices were the foundation of his ambition, the driving force behind his desire to be someone more than just another kid growing up in a neighborhood that often felt overlooked. As Daniel dressed, he could already smell the savory scent of toast and eggs wafting through the air, mixing with the rich aroma of fresh coffee. His mother had always been an early riser, determined to start each day on the right foot. Despite working long hours as a nurse at the local hospital, she always made sure that her son was well-fed and prepared for the challenges ahead. There were no luxuries in their lives, but Daniel never felt the absence of anything. He had love, he had drive, and most importantly, he had his mother, who had poured every ounce of herself into ensuring he had a shot at a better life. "Good morning, Mom," Daniel greeted, walking into the small kitchen, where his mother stood at the stove, flipping eggs with practiced precision. Her hands moved gracefully, even as the exhaustion from another long night shift lingered in her eyes. "Good morning, baby," she replied, offering him a warm smile that made the wrinkles around her eyes deepen. "I made you some breakfast. You've got to keep that energy up for today. Big day ahead, right?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah, Mom. I'm ready." He grinned at her, trying to reassure her that everything was going to be okay. Angela looked at him with a mixture of pride and concern. "You're growing up so fast, Daniel. One day, you'll be out there doing great things. I just know it." Daniel felt a rush of affection for her words, but also the pressure that came with them. She had so many hopes and dreams for him, and he didn't want to let her down. But at the same time, he was determined to make his own way in the world, to prove to himself, and to everyone who doubted him, that he could be somebody. Not just another statistic, not just another kid from a neighborhood that the world had forgotten. Sitting down at the table, Daniel dug into the breakfast his mother had prepared. They talked about the usual things: school, the weather, her work. His mother always tried to keep things light, never letting the weight of her burdens show. She wanted him to focus on his future, not on the struggles of the present. But Daniel could see it in her eyes, the tiredness that didn't quite go away, the constant worry that she tried to mask with her smiles. As he ate, his mind began to drift to the upcoming school day. It was just another Tuesday, but there was something about today that felt different. Something that he couldn't quite put his finger on. After breakfast, Daniel grabbed his backpack, slung it over his shoulder, and kissed his mother on the cheek. "I'll see you later, Mom. Love you." "Love you too, sweetheart. Have a great day at school. And remember, your future starts today. Don't waste it." With those words echoing in his mind, Daniel headed out the door. The morning air was crisp, and the streets were already busy with people heading to work, buses, and cars zipping by. Daniel walked with purpose, his feet carrying him toward his school, which was a few blocks away. His neighborhood was a mix of old apartment buildings and small houses, but there was a sense of community here, even in the face of adversity. People looked out for each other, even if life wasn't easy. As he approached the school gates, Daniel felt the familiar nervous energy creeping in. High school wasn't always the easiest place for him. Being one of the few black kids in a predominantly white school came with its challenges, but Daniel had learned to navigate the social dynamics with the confidence that his mother had instilled in him. He didn't let the looks or the comments bother him. He had bigger things to worry about. Inside the school, the hallways were bustling with students, all heading to their respective classes. Daniel slipped into his seat in his first period math class, trying to focus on the lesson as his teacher droned on about algebra. But his mind kept wandering back to his dream, the one where he had already made it big. He could see himself on the basketball court, standing tall, an MVP, the crowd roaring his name. It was always a distant dream, but with each passing day, it seemed just a little bit more attainable. Little did Daniel know, the day ahead would change the course of his life forever. And it all started with a simple, unexpected encounter. An encounter that would test his integrity, his values, and everything he had ever believed in. The unlikely encounter. The bell rang, signaling the end of the first period, and Daniel gathered his things, slinging his backpack over his shoulder as he made his way toward his second class of the day. His thoughts were still preoccupied with his aspirations of becoming a basketball star, but he forced himself to focus on the task at hand, schoolwork. Algebra was important, after all, even if it didn't quite feel as exciting as hitting a game-winning shot at the buzzer. As Daniel walked through the crowded hallways, he passed by his friends, exchanging brief greetings and a few laughs. Among them was James, a tall, lanky kid who had been Daniel's closest friend since they were both in elementary school. James was one of the few kids who never treated Daniel any differently because of the color of his skin. They had been through thick and thin together, from awkward school dances to after-school games of pickup basketball. James was the kind of friend who would have his back no matter what. "Hey, Daniel, you ready for the game later?" James asked, grinning widely as he fell and stepped beside him. Daniel smiled back, but there was a hint of hesitation in his voice. "Yeah, but I'm more focused on the practice today. Coach said if we nail it, I might get a spot on the starting lineup. It's not going to be easy." James raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. "Starting lineup? Man, that's huge. You've got this, bro." Daniel's heart swelled with pride, but he quickly pushed the feeling down. "We'll see. Let's just get through today first." They reached their next class, English, and Daniel slid into his seat, trying to concentrate on the lesson. The teacher, Mrs. Harris, was discussing the theme of perseverance in the Odyssey. Daniel had read the book twice in his life, but the deeper meaning didn't always hit home. For him, perseverance wasn't about mythical heroes battling monsters or embarking on long journeys. It was about making it through another day, keeping his head up despite the odds, and staying focused on his future. As the class proceeded, Daniel's mind kept drifting to the upcoming basketball game. His focus was sharp, but there was an undeniable tension in the back of his mind. Every time he thought about the possibility of getting that starting spot, the excitement built, but so did the pressure. His family had always supported him, but he couldn't help but feel the weight of their expectations, the idea that one day he would make something of himself, something more than the life he was born into. At lunch, Daniel and James sat together, as usual, under the oak tree in the schoolyard. The sun was high in the sky, and the warmth of the afternoon air felt like a brief reprieve from the cool autumn breeze. As they unpacked their lunches, Daniel noticed something strange across the schoolyard. A man in a suit was standing near the school's entrance, talking to two officers in uniform. He didn't recognize the man, but there was something about him that caught Daniel's attention. The way he stood tall, his posture rigid, like someone used to being in charge. "That's weird," James muttered, looking over at the man as well. "You think he's some kind of VIP or something?" Daniel shrugged, but something about the whole scene seemed off. The officers were nodding in the man's direction, and Daniel noticed they were looking over at him too, as though they had been talking about something important. He quickly pushed the thought aside and tried to focus on his lunch. But the nagging feeling that something unusual was unfolding wouldn't leave him alone. The rest of the lunch period went by uneventfully, and Daniel tried to shake off the unease he had felt earlier. But as the final bell of the day rang, signaling the end of classes, things began to take an unexpected turn. Walking out of the school gates with James, Daniel noticed that the man from earlier was now standing directly in front of the entrance, flanked by the two officers. His presence made Daniel feel uneasy, as if the man were waiting for something or someone. The crowd of students scattered, eager to get home or head to extracurricular activities, but Daniel found himself walking more slowly, trying to process what was happening. "Maybe he's here for a school visit or something," James suggested, clearly trying to dismiss the odd tension in the air. But Daniel wasn't so sure. There was something more to it. As they neared the entrance, one of the officers stepped forward and looked directly at Daniel. His face was stern, and his eyes seemed to linger on him a little too long. Daniel froze for a moment, a sense of dread filling his chest. He wasn't doing anything wrong, so why was the officer looking at him like that? Before Daniel could even ask James what was going on, the man in the suit suddenly turned to face him, his eyes narrowing. There was a flicker of recognition in the man's gaze, as if he had been searching for him. "Excuse me, young man," the man said in a smooth voice, walking toward Daniel with deliberate steps. "Are you Daniel Thompson?" Daniel blinked, taken aback. "Yes, that's me. Can I help you with something?" The man paused for a moment, sizing him up. "My name is Mr. Carter. I'm the CEO of a company downtown. I believe you found something of mine this morning, something very important." Daniel's mind raced. What was going on? Had he done something wrong? He started to speak, but was interrupted by Mr. Carter, who continued without missing a beat. "I believe you found my wallet," Mr. Carter said, holding up a leather wallet that Daniel instantly recognized. It had been left on the sidewalk earlier that morning, just outside the corner store. Daniel had picked it up and pocketed it, intending to return it, but the day had slipped away from him. "Do you mind telling me where it is?" Daniel's heart sank. He had never expected anything like this. He was simply trying to do the right thing by returning a lost item. What did he do now? Should he speak up or remain silent? He wasn't sure what to do with the sudden attention, especially from someone so important. Before Daniel could respond, one of the officers spoke up, his tone much colder than before. "Mr. Carter has informed us that the wallet contains a large sum of money that should not have been in your possession," the officer said, his eyes scanning Daniel with suspicion. Daniel's stomach dropped as the weight of the situation became all too clear. They were accusing him of stealing the wallet. Despite the fact that he had only found it and intended to return it, the implications were suddenly dire. The presence of the police, the authoritative tone of the officer, and the eyes of everyone around him made Daniel feel smaller than ever before. And that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was that Mr. Carter, a millionaire business tycoon, seemed to have already made up his mind about Daniel. "You know, I've seen this before," Mr. Carter said with a dismissive chuckle, his gaze now piercing through Daniel. "A young boy, probably from a rough neighborhood, finding something valuable and thinking he can just take it for himself. But that's not how the world works. There are consequences for these kinds of things." Daniel stood frozen, his mind spinning as the crowd around them grew larger. How would he explain himself now? The unseen truth. Daniel stood there, feeling as though the ground beneath him had been pulled away. His heart hammered in his chest, each beat louder than the last. The whispers from the growing crowd of students around him became a blur of unintelligible murmurs. The sharp, cold gaze of Mr. Carter, the wealthy businessman, drilled into him, and the officer's words echoed in his ears like a drumbeat. "You found something of value," the officer continued, his voice almost a sneer. "And instead of turning it in immediately, you waited. Why is that? It's not often that kids from your neighborhood are honest about these things." Daniel's mouth went dry, his hands trembled, and his mind raced to formulate a response. But the words wouldn't come. How could he possibly explain himself when the world seemed to have already made up its mind about him? The other officer, standing just a few feet away, watched the exchange with a hard expression. He had a clipboard in his hands, the kind of formality that only made Daniel feel more out of place. They were treating him like a criminal, and he didn't know how to fight back against the weight of their assumptions. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive, and for a moment, Daniel felt completely alone. But then, something inside him snapped. His mother's voice, the one that had always encouraged him to do the right thing, even when it was hard, echoed in his head. "Do what's right, Daniel, no matter what. Be better than they expect you to be." He took a deep breath, his legs stiff but determined, and stepped forward. He wasn't going to let them define him by their prejudice, their assumptions. "I didn't steal it," Daniel said, his voice steady, though his hands still shook. "I found it on the sidewalk this morning. It was just lying there. And I didn't know who it belonged to. I've been trying to figure out how to return it all day, but things got crazy, and I didn't know who to give it to. So I kept it, because I didn't want anyone else to take it. That's all. I didn't take anything that wasn't mine." For a moment, the words hung in the air, too simple to be believed in the face of what seemed like overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The officer didn't immediately respond, but Daniel could see the subtle shift in his expression, a flicker of doubt passing through his eyes. Maybe it wasn't as cut and dry as they thought. But Mr. Carter wasn't buying it. "This is exactly what I mean," he said with a sneer, his voice dripping with disdain. "A kid from a place like yours, with no sense of what's right or wrong, just taking what isn't his and thinking he can get away with it. I should have known better." The words stung, each one hitting its mark. Daniel's stomach twisted, but he refused to let them see the effect they were having on him. He couldn't let his guard down now. If he did, if he showed any weakness, he feared it would be the end of everything he had worked for. But just as Daniel's shoulders began to slump under the weight of Mr. Carter's accusation, something unexpected happened. James, who had been standing off to the side, watching in silence up until now, stepped forward, his voice breaking through the tension in the air. "Hold up," James said, his tone firm but calm. "I've known Daniel for years. He wouldn't steal anything. He's one of the most honest people I know. If he found that wallet, he's trying to do the right thing. This whole thing doesn't make sense." Daniel's head snapped to look at his friend. James wasn't backing down, even though the situation was quickly escalating. The officer glanced at him, his brow furrowed in irritation. "Who are you to say anything?" The officer barked, his tone dismissive. "I'm his friend," James replied, standing his ground. "And I'd known him long enough to know that he's not a thief." The two officers exchanged a glance, clearly weighing their options. But before they could speak, the crowd around them began to murmur, voices growing louder in support of Daniel. Some students had begun to gather, whispering among themselves, their eyes flicking between Daniel and Mr. Carter, sensing the unfairness of the situation. A few of Daniel's classmates, who had witnessed the exchange, chimed in. "Daniel's always been the guy who helps people out," one of them said. "He wouldn't do anything like that." Another student, a girl named Mia, stepped forward, her eyes locking with the officers. "I saw him this morning. He didn't even hesitate. He picked up that wallet and started looking for the owner. That's the kind of person he is. He wasn't trying to take it. For a brief moment, Daniel's hope surged, as though the truth was beginning to crack through the wall of doubt that had been built around him. The students' voices grew stronger, and the officer's resolve seemed to falter. Even Mr. Carter, who had stood confidently until now, shifted his weight uncomfortably. But then, just as quickly as the moment of clarity had arrived, it slipped away. Mr. Carter, his face turning red with frustration, took a step toward the officers. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "I don't have time for this. If you're not going to do your job properly, I'll take matters into my own hands. I'll make sure this kid understands what happens when people think they can just take things that don't belong to them." The threat in his voice was unmistakable. It wasn't just about the wallet anymore. It was about Daniel's entire future, a rich man with the power to make life difficult for a teenager like him, a teenager from the wrong side of town. Daniel could feel the weight of it, the growing pressure of what was at stake. The officers exchanged another glance, clearly unsure how to proceed. It wasn't just the accusations of theft that were troubling. They were aware of the deeper implications here. A young black boy accused by a powerful white businessman. What would happen next? But then, before anything could escalate further, a voice from the school entrance cut through the tension. "Mr. Carter, that's enough." The voice was calm, but commanding, and it belonged to none other than Mrs. Harris, Daniel's English teacher. She stepped forward, her expression steely but measured. "I understand that you're upset, but accusing a student of theft without proper evidence isn't acceptable. I suggest we handle this matter with more respect and due process." For a moment, the schoolyard was silent. The officer who had been leading the conversation turned to Mrs. Harris, his eyes narrowing. "And you are?" "I'm the English teacher here, and I've seen Daniel's character firsthand," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "If he says he found the wallet and intended to return it, then I believe him. If you want to pursue this further, I suggest we involve the school administration and take a closer look at the facts." The shift in the dynamic was immediate. The students around them stood a little taller, emboldened by the support that had suddenly appeared. James gave Daniel a quick, encouraging nod, and even the officer who had been skeptical seemed to soften just a bit. Mr. Carter, however, was not pleased. His face twisted in annoyance, but there was nothing he could say in the face of the growing collective resistance. He looked around, clearly realizing that the situation was slipping out of his control. "This isn't over," Mr. Carter muttered under his breath before turning and storming off, his two officers reluctantly following him. Daniel stood there for a long moment, his legs shaking with adrenaline, but a sense of relief slowly began to settle in. The crowd around him started to disperse, but their support lingered, and for the first time that day, Daniel felt a glimmer of hope. "Thanks," he whispered to James, his voice hoarse. "You don't have to thank me, man," James said with a grin. "I've got your back. Always." As the sun began to set behind the buildings, Daniel looked up at the sky, a new resolve burning in his chest. He wasn't going to let anyone define who he was. The world could be as unfair as it wanted to be, but Daniel Thompson was going to rise above it. The unfolding battle. The next morning, Daniel woke up with a lingering heaviness in his chest. Though the events of the day before had left him shaken, a part of him was still in disbelief at how close things had come to unraveling. The police, the accusations, the gaze of Mr. Carter, all of it seemed like a bad dream. He had never expected such a confrontation, not in a million years. All he had done was pick up a wallet and try to do the right thing by returning it. How had everything gotten so complicated? As Daniel sat at the breakfast table, his mother, as always, was the first to notice his distant demeanor. She placed a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of him, her smile warm, but her eyes filled with concern. "Everything okay, Daniel?" she asked softly, wiping her hands on her apron. Daniel forced a smile. "Yeah, Mom. Just tired, I guess. She didn't press further but simply nodded, as if understanding that he needed space. The truth was, though, that Daniel didn't know how to tell her what had happened. How could he explain that his own integrity, his own character, had been called into question? How could he tell her that the very thing he had been taught his whole life, to be honest, to be a good person, to rise above adversity, was being turned against him in a world that didn't always seem to value those principles? His mother kissed his forehead before he left for school, the same gesture she had given him every morning since he was a child. But today, it felt heavier, leaden with the unspoken words they both knew had to be said but weren't. At school, the atmosphere was different. Students whispered in the halls, casting furtive glances at Daniel as he walked through the corridors. Some looked at him with sympathy, others with curiosity, as if trying to piece together the story they had heard and determine the truth. It didn't help that the media had already begun to catch wind of the incident. Local news stations ran brief, sensationalized segments on the confrontation outside the school gates, framing it as a tale of a thieving student caught red-handed in a clash between young and powerful. Daniel didn't know how they had twisted the narrative so quickly, but the damage was done. His classmates, especially those who weren't as close to him, seemed to view him through the lens of the news report. He could feel the weight of their stares, the silent judgment in their eyes. It wasn't that anyone had outright called him a criminal, but the accusation still hovered like a shadow over his head. In the middle of the day, as Daniel sat in class, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out discreetly and saw that it was a message from James. His friend's words were simple, but they carried a heavy weight. "You good, bro? We all got your back. Don't let it get to you." Daniel typed a quick reply. "Thanks, man. Just trying to keep my head up." He sighed and tucked the phone back into his pocket, feeling a small sense of comfort in the fact that he wasn't completely alone in this. James had been his rock throughout his entire life, and now, more than ever, he needed his support. But just as Daniel began to feel a sense of calm, the school bell rang, signaling the end of the day. His relief was short-lived as he stepped into the hallways and found himself face to face with a teacher he had never spoken to before, Mr. Turner, the school's principal. "Daniel Thompson?" Mr. Turner asked, his voice surprisingly stern, as though this were a matter of great importance. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He had hoped to slip under the radar for the rest of the day, but it seemed that wasn't going to happen. "Yes, sir," Daniel answered, keeping his voice steady despite the panic building inside. "I need you to come with me," Mr. Turner said, not waiting for a response before turning and walking toward the principal's office. Daniel followed reluctantly, his steps heavy. What now? Was this about the wallet again? Did the school believe the accusations too? Inside the principal's office, Mr. Turner gestured for Daniel to sit. The room was dimly lit, and the walls were lined with bookshelves filled with thick binders and awards from years of school administration. But the desk in front of Daniel was stacked with papers, legal-looking papers, some marked with bold red ink. "I'm sure you're aware of the situation," Mr. Turner began, his voice more measured than it had been in the hallway. "The incident with Mr. Carter outside the school yesterday has caused quite a stir. There have been complaints, both from Mr. Carter and from parents who are concerned about the safety and well-being of their children." Daniel's heart sank. He had known that it wouldn't just end after the crowd dispersed and the officers left. But this felt like a whole new level. The principal was talking about complaints as if they were facts. Mr. Turner continued, his gaze unwavering. "Mr. Carter has requested that we take action. He wants to make sure that what happened is properly addressed and that there are no misunderstandings moving forward." Daniel tried to swallow the lump in his throat, but it felt like it was stuck, lodged there by the weight of Mr. Carter's words. Was this it? Was he about to be expelled, or worse, arrested? "I want to make it clear, Daniel," Mr. Turner said, leaning forward slightly. "We take accusations of theft seriously. This isn't just about returning a wallet. It's about trust. And right now, it's clear that your actions have raised concerns. Daniel's mind raced, trying to process everything. He had done the right thing. He had tried to return the wallet. He had no idea why Mr. Carter was so insistent on turning it into something it wasn't, but this was bigger than him now. And Mr. Carter was clearly using his influence to bend the situation in his favor. "I didn't steal anything," Daniel said, his voice tight. "I found that wallet, and I tried to do the right thing. I didn't know what else to do. I wasn't trying to take what didn't belong to me. I understand your side, Daniel," Mr. Turner interjected, cutting him off. "But understand this, we have a responsibility to this school, to the other students, and to the reputation of this institution. Your situation has become a public matter, and we can't ignore that." Daniel's heart raced as he tried to understand what that meant. Was he being accused of something more than what had happened? Was this about a bigger agenda? "So, what are you going to do?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Turner didn't immediately respond. He stared at the stack of papers before him for a long moment, as though weighing his words carefully. Finally, he spoke. "I'm not going to make any decisions right now. I want to give you a chance to explain yourself, to clear the air. But I need you to understand that things are going to be different now. I don't know how, but you need to be prepared for the fallout. There will be more questions, more scrutiny. We need to handle this carefully." Daniel nodded slowly, but inside, he was reeling. He hadn't stolen anything. He hadn't done anything wrong. And yet, it seemed like the weight of the world was coming down on him. Mr. Turner stood up and opened the door, signaling that their conversation was over. "We'll talk again soon, Daniel. I'll make sure to follow up with you once I have more information." As Daniel stepped out into the hallway, the world seemed even more oppressive than before. He had always known that life wasn't going to be easy, but this was a whole different kind of fight. But as he walked past the classrooms, past the students who still watched him with pity or curiosity, Daniel realized something. This wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. He wasn't going to back down. Rising above. The following days at school felt like an uphill battle for Daniel. Each step seemed to take more effort than the last, as though the weight of the world had been placed on his shoulders. The whispers in the hallways had died down, but they had left behind a lingering tension. Students who once greeted him with smiles now avoided his gaze, and even those who had stood up for him began to distance themselves, unsure of how to navigate the fallout of the controversy. Despite all of this, Daniel's resolve only strengthened. He wasn't going to let this incident define him. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong. He had done exactly what he was taught to do: find a lost item and try to return it. But the way people were treating him made him question how much of the world's expectations were based on preconceived notions rather than truth. The turning point came the following Friday afternoon, just after lunch. Daniel was sitting in the courtyard, staring at the ground, lost in thought when he saw James approaching. His friend's face was serious, but there was a spark in his eyes that Daniel hadn't seen in a while. "Yo, you good?" James asked, taking a seat beside him. Daniel looked up at him, offering a half-smile. "Just tired, man. It feels like everyone's been looking at me like I'm a criminal." James shook his head. "I get it, but you can't let that stuff get to you. The truth is on your side." Daniel nodded, though he wasn't so sure. "I keep telling myself that. But Mr. Carter is still pushing this thing. The school's making it sound like I did something wrong, like my word doesn't matter." James let out a frustrated sigh. "Yeah, I get that. But listen, the truth doesn't need to be shouted from the rooftops. It's gonna come out eventually. And people are gonna realize they were wrong about you." Daniel looked up at him, seeing the sincerity in James' expression. "I don't know, man. It feels like it's never going to end. Everyone just believes what they hear, and once that story's out there, there's no going back." James leaned in a little closer, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. "You've got to fight for yourself, Daniel. Sometimes you can't just wait for people to come around. You have to make them listen." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his mind turning over what James had said. The more he thought about it, the more it made sense. If he was going to get through this, he couldn't sit back and wait for others to clear his name. He had to take control of the situation and make sure that people saw the truth, his truth. That evening, as Daniel sat at his desk doing his homework, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from his mother. It read, "I saw the news. Don't worry. I'll be there tomorrow." Daniel felt a tightness in his chest as he read her words. His mom had always been his greatest supporter, the one person who never doubted him, no matter what the world said. But he could hear the underlying worry in her message. She knew how hard this was for him. She knew how much it hurt to be misunderstood. He didn't want her to worry, but deep down, he knew that this battle was going to be bigger than just him. He needed to stand up not just for himself, but for everything his mother had sacrificed for him to be where he was. She had worked long hours, never complained, and always told him that his integrity was his most valuable asset. He wasn't going to let anyone take that from him. The next morning, when Daniel arrived at school, he found that the situation had escalated even further. News vans were parked outside, their satellite dishes pointing toward the sky, and reporters were swarming around the entrance. The controversy had made it beyond the small community. This was now a public spectacle. As Daniel walked through the school gates, he noticed the way the reporters turned their cameras toward him. They didn't ask questions, at least not yet, but the cameras followed him, capturing every step. It was as if they were waiting for him to slip, for him to show any sign of guilt. Daniel felt a knot in his stomach. This wasn't just a school issue anymore. His entire life was being dissected in public. And yet, he couldn't let them see how scared he was. He had to hold his ground. As he approached the entrance, he was greeted by a familiar face, Mrs. Harris, his English teacher, who had supported him the day the officers showed up at school. She gave him a small, reassuring smile, but her eyes were filled with something more, determination. "Daniel, you've got this," she said quietly, her voice firm with the confidence of someone who had seen his true character. "You're stronger than you think." Before Daniel could respond, a voice broke through the air. It was Mr. Turner, the principal. He was walking briskly toward him, his expression unreadable. "Daniel, we need to talk," he said, his voice serious but not unfriendly. "Follow me." Daniel's heart skipped a beat, but he followed the principal into the office. Mrs. Harris gave him a nod of encouragement before she stepped back into the hallway. Once inside the office, Mr. Turner closed the door behind him. "I'm sure you're aware of how much this situation has escalated," he began. "We've had calls from the school district and even from some of the media. Mr. Carter is pushing for disciplinary action, and frankly, the pressure is mounting." Daniel braced himself. He wasn't surprised. He had expected this from the moment the media got involved. "I'm not here to judge you, Daniel," Mr. Turner continued, his voice softer now. "But I need to know where you stand on this. I need you to understand that the stakes are higher than you might think." Daniel took a deep breath. This was it. He had to make a decision now. "Mr. Turner, I'm not guilty," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "I didn't steal anything. I found that wallet and tried to do the right thing by returning it. I know what the media is saying, and I know what Mr. Carter's saying, but none of that changes the truth. I didn't do anything wrong." For a moment, Mr. Turner didn't speak. He just looked at Daniel, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I believe you, Daniel, but I'm not sure the rest of the world will." Daniel's heart dropped, but he held his ground. He knew what he had to do next. "I'll make them listen," Daniel said, his voice quieter now, but no less resolute. "I'm not going to let anyone control this narrative. I'll tell my side, and I'll make sure they hear it." Mr. Turner didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked over to the window and stared out at the courtyard, where the cameras were still rolling. After a long pause, he turned back to Daniel. "Then we'll do this together," he said, his voice quieter but stronger than before. "I'm not going to let them bury the truth." Daniel felt a sense of relief wash over him. He wasn't alone in this. Mrs. Harris, Mr. Turner, and even his friends, all of them were standing with him. And with their support, he knew that he could rise above the lies. That afternoon, the media frenzy reached its peak when Daniel stood in front of the cameras. His mom was by his side, her hand on his shoulder, offering him a silent strength. And as the reporters fired their questions, Daniel took a deep breath and shared his story. He told them the truth, the whole truth, without hesitation, without fear. It wasn't easy. It wasn't comfortable. But it was right. And in that moment, Daniel knew that he was finally in control of his own story. The truth unveiled. The days following Daniel's decision to publicly share his side of the story marked the beginning of a slow but significant shift. The media buzz had only intensified in the immediate aftermath of his interview. But there was a difference now. It wasn't just a one-sided frenzy where Daniel was portrayed as a criminal or a misunderstood boy. No, now the narrative was evolving. There was room for his version of events to be heard. The press conference Daniel had reluctantly agreed to attend turned out to be a pivotal moment. His words had struck a chord, not just in the school, but throughout the community. For the first time, people were forced to confront the facts and the human element behind the sensationalized headlines. They saw Daniel, a young man who wasn't just a face in the crowd, but someone with integrity who had tried to do the right thing. And the more the community began to hear his story, the more they realized how easily their assumptions had been shaped by Mr. Carter's wealth and influence. The media's interest had been relentless. News stations kept airing clips from the press conference, repeating Daniel's statement. "I didn't steal anything. I found the wallet, and I returned it because that's what I was taught to do." The simplicity and honesty of those words resonated deeply with viewers, especially with those who felt like Daniel was a reflection of the challenges faced by people in marginalized communities. They understood his pain, his frustration. The story gained traction on social media. Memes emerged, not mocking Daniel, but celebrating his bravery. Hashtags like #DanielTheTruth and #InnocentSynth Face of Injustice began trending. Supporters from all walks of life shared their own stories of being misunderstood or wrongfully judged, rallying behind Daniel as a symbol of resilience. It was a movement of sorts, one that wasn't just about Daniel clearing his name, but about raising awareness of the biases and injustices people like him faced every day. Meanwhile, at the school, the atmosphere had begun to shift as well. The whispers that had once followed Daniel in every hallway had lessened, replaced by a cautious curiosity. Some students who had distanced themselves from him began to come around, offering small gestures of support, a word of encouragement, or simply a nod of acknowledgement in the hallway. James, as always, was by Daniel's side through it all. He knew what his friend was going through, and he couldn't help but be proud of the way Daniel had handled everything. While Daniel had been publicly under fire, he had kept his composure, never lashing out, always staying true to who he was. The weight of the situation hadn't been easy for Daniel, but the support from his friends, his mother, and the unexpected allies within the school had given him the strength to endure. Even Mr. Turner, the principal, who had once seemed like a distant authority figure, had become an ally, standing by Daniel's side and publicly affirming his belief in the truth of the young man's words. It was a small act, but in the face of adversity, it meant more than Daniel could put into words. The turning point came when Mr. Carter, the wealthy businessman, finally agreed to meet with Daniel. The pressure from the community, along with the mounting media attention, had forced his hand. He had initially stayed silent after the press conference, perhaps hoping the controversy would die down on its own. But now it was clear that his actions, or rather, his refusal to acknowledge the truth, were under intense scrutiny. Daniel's heart raced when his mother told him about the meeting. She had received a formal invitation for them to meet at Mr. Carter's office, where the two parties could finally discuss what had transpired. The idea of facing Mr. Carter again was nerve-wracking, but Daniel knew that this meeting could be the final step in clearing his name. They arrived at Mr. Carter's sleek, modern office building on a cold Monday morning. The lobby was pristine, with polished floors that gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the air smelled faintly of expensive perfume and coffee. Daniel felt a little out of place as he stood there, clutching the straps of his worn backpack, but his mother squeezed his hand, a silent reminder that he wasn't alone in this. They were escorted to a conference room on the top floor, where Mr. Carter was waiting, his expensive suit impeccable, his posture straight and formal. He rose when they entered, but Daniel could tell that the man was uncomfortable. He was trying to maintain his air of control, but there was an unease about him that Daniel hadn't noticed before. "Daniel," Mr. Carter greeted him with a tight smile. "I hope you've been doing well." "I've been better," Daniel replied coolly, taking a seat at the table, his mother beside him. "And I think we both know why we're here." Mr. Carter nodded but said nothing, his expression guarded. For a long moment, there was silence in the room. Then, Daniel spoke again, his voice steady, his resolve unwavering. "You said I took something that didn't belong to me," Daniel began, locking eyes with Mr. Carter. "But you're wrong. I didn't take anything. I found a wallet, and I did what I was taught to do. I returned it. I didn't have to. I could have just kept it, or I could have turned it in to someone else, but I decided to return it directly to the person it belonged to. And for that, I'm being treated like a criminal." Mr. Carter shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I'm sorry you feel that way," he said, though his tone lacked genuine remorse. "But you have to understand that I couldn't just let something like this slide. The situation was complicated." "Complicated?" Daniel's voice rose slightly. "It wasn't complicated. You made it complicated when you decided that a young black kid couldn't possibly be telling the truth. You assumed I took something because of how I look, because of where I'm from, and that's not okay." Mr. Carter's face flushed. For a moment, Daniel thought he might become defensive, but instead, the older man simply looked down, his gaze softening, as if the weight of his actions was finally starting to register. I didn't see it that way," Mr. Carter said, his voice quieter now, almost reflective. I reacted out of fear. Fear that I had been wronged, and I let that cloud my judgment. I let my position, my wealth, my power cloud my understanding of the truth." Daniel didn't say anything for a moment. He didn't need to. The silence in the room was more powerful than any words could have been. He had expected this to be an argument, a battle of egos, but it wasn't. It was a moment of reflection. A moment where, for the first time, Mr. Carter was seeing the situation from a different perspective. "Daniel," Mr. Carter said, looking up at him, his voice strained, "I owe you an apology. I misjudged you. I let my assumptions get in the way of what should have been a simple act of kindness. You didn't deserve the way I treated you." Daniel's heart thudded in his chest. He had never expected an apology, not from someone like Mr. Carter. And yet there it was. It wasn't the kind of apology that instantly made everything better, but it was a start, a step toward healing, a step toward understanding. "I appreciate that," Daniel said softly, his voice quiet but firm. "But it's not just about me. It's about how the world treats people like me. People who don't have the luxury of being believed when they tell the truth." The room was still. For a brief moment, the world outside seemed to fade away. Daniel knew that this wasn't the end of the story. There was still work to be done. There would still be battles to fight. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. He had stood up for himself. He had fought for his truth. And in that moment, Daniel realized that no matter how many obstacles were placed in his path, he would always rise above. A new beginning. The apology from Mr. Carter, though unexpected, did little to quell the storm of emotions that had been building in Daniel. There was a sense of closure in his heart, a feeling that the truth had finally been acknowledged, at least by one of the people involved. But at the same time, it wasn't the end of the battle. Not by a long shot. The world beyond that meeting was still filled with whispers, assumptions, and judgments that Daniel had to navigate. As the weeks passed, the media buzz began to die down, but Daniel could feel the lingering presence of what had transpired. His name had been splashed across every news outlet, and people still spoke of the boy who found the millionaire's wallet, as though that was all there was to his story. People who barely knew him were still forming opinions, still treating him as a symbol, but rarely as the person he was. The students at school had mostly returned to their routine, but a few, the ones who had once avoided him, now sought him out. They weren't necessarily friends, but there was a new understanding between them. Some students had come to him and admitted, in quiet voices, that they had judged him wrongly. They had assumed things about him based on where he came from or what he looked like. Some even apologized. But Daniel wasn't sure he could forgive them so easily. He still spent most of his time with James, his one true friend. James had been a constant throughout the entire ordeal, never wavering, always having his back. Daniel had been through a lot, but he could never have made it through without his unwavering support. One Friday afternoon, as Daniel and James sat in the courtyard again, Daniel's phone buzzed with a notification. It was from his mom. "There's someone here to see you at the apartment. It's Mr. Carter." Daniel stared at the message for a moment, his mind racing. Mr. Carter. After everything that had happened, why would he show up at his apartment? He'd heard nothing from him in days, and this sudden appearance felt like an intrusion. "What's up?" James asked, noticing the confused expression on Daniel's face. "I need to go home," Daniel muttered. He didn't explain himself, but he could tell that James was about to ask more questions. He simply needed to go. The trip home felt longer than usual, each minute ticking by slowly as Daniel wondered why Mr. Carter was there, unannounced, in his apartment. His mind was filled with a mix of apprehension and curiosity. After everything that had happened, why would the man show up at his doorstep? Was this another attempt at an apology? Or was it a confrontation Daniel wasn't prepared for? When Daniel arrived, his mother greeted him at the door with a weary smile. She didn't speak immediately but stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. "Mr. Carter is in the living room," she said softly. Daniel's heart thudded in his chest. He had never been nervous around his mother, but in that moment, he could sense her unease. Something was off, and he couldn't quite put his finger on it. As he walked into the living room, he saw Mr. Carter standing by the window, his posture rigid, his hands clasped behind his back. He was no longer in his sleek business suit. Instead, he wore a simple sweater and slacks, but he still looked out of place in Daniel's humble home. The wealth he carried with him was visible in the smallest details, the sharp cut of his clothes, the way his watch gleamed even in the dim light. When Mr. Carter turned to face him, his expression was unreadable. It wasn't the cold, distant gaze Daniel had encountered during their first meeting, nor the apologetic tone he'd heard during their confrontation at school. No, this was something else, something deeper, more contemplative. "Daniel," Mr. Carter began, his voice softer than it had been in their previous encounters. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and I realize that there's something more that I owe you, something beyond an apology." Daniel stood still for a moment, unsure of how to respond. This was uncharted territory. He'd expected another apology, maybe even an offer to make amends. But Mr. Carter's words were different, laced with an urgency that caught Daniel off guard. "What do you mean?" Daniel asked cautiously, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. Mr. Carter took a deep breath before continuing. "I want to offer you something. Not just an apology, but an opportunity. I've spent most of my life in a bubble, only interacting with people like myself, people who look like me, think like me. I've never truly understood the struggles that people like you face on a daily basis, but I want to change that. I want to do something that can help." Daniel felt a knot form in his stomach. He wasn't sure where this was going, but he wasn't sure he was ready to trust Mr. Carter just yet. After everything that had happened, the idea of an opportunity from the very man who had caused so much pain felt complicated. "What are you saying?" Daniel asked, his voice quiet, almost guarded. "I want to invest in you, Daniel," Mr. Carter said, his voice gaining strength. "I know that may sound strange, but hear me out. I've seen your resilience, your ability to stand up for yourself when others would have crumbled. You're the kind of person I wish I had known when I was younger. You have the potential to go far, and I want to help you get there." Daniel's mind raced, the implications of Mr. Carter's words sinking in. He had never expected something like this. Not from Mr. Carter, not from anyone. The wealthy businessman wanted to invest in his future, but what did that mean? Was this some kind of charity, a way to ease his conscience, or was this a genuine attempt to make amends for past wrongs? "I don't know, Mr. Carter," Daniel said slowly. "I appreciate the offer. I really do. But I can't help but wonder why. Why now? Why me?" Mr. Carter's expression softened, and for the first time, he seemed vulnerable. "I don't know," he admitted. "I guess I saw myself in you. I saw a kid with potential, someone who was willing to do the right thing, even when it wasn't easy. I can't undo what I did, but I can make sure you have the chance to do something incredible. I'm offering you mentorship, guidance, and yes, financial support, but I want you to do it on your terms. No strings attached. No expectations." Daniel stood there for a long moment, unsure of what to think. It felt surreal. A part of him wanted to reject the offer outright, to walk away from it all, but another part of him knew that opportunities like this didn't come often. And while he didn't fully trust Mr. Carter, he also knew that the world was full of contradictions. People were messy, imperfect, and sometimes the greatest opportunities came from the most unlikely places. "Let me think about it," Daniel said finally, his voice firm. "I'm not sure I'm ready to make a decision like this." Mr. Carter nodded, understanding the weight of the decision. "Take all the time you need, Daniel. I'm here when you're ready." As Mr. Carter left the apartment that evening, Daniel felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. He had learned so much over the past few months, about himself, about others, and about the complexities of the world. He had learned that even the most difficult challenges could lead to unexpected growth. But more than anything, he had learned that the truth had a way of shining through, no matter how dark the world around him seemed. In the weeks that followed, Daniel carefully considered Mr. Carter's offer. It wasn't just about the money or the connections. It was about the opportunity to change his life and the lives of others. And with each passing day, Daniel felt more confident in the path he was beginning to carve out for himself. The story of the missing wallet had become just that, history. What mattered now was what Daniel chose to do with the future that lay before him. And with a sense of clarity, Daniel finally made his decision. He would rise. He would take the opportunity, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been underestimated, for everyone who had ever been misjudged. He would make sure his voice was heard, his story would be told, and he would prove that integrity, courage, and truth could always lead to something greater.